May 8, 1945, Bad Tals, Bavaria. The smell of diesel exhaust and spring rain hung in the air as American tanks stood silent in formation, their engines cooling after the long drive south through the wreckage of the Third Reich. General George S. Patton, Jr., stood on the reviewing stand, pearl-handled revolvers at his hips, watching his Third Army soldiers march in victory parade. Around him, American flags snapped in the wind. In the distance, smoke still rose from German towns that had been battlefields days before. The war in Europe was over. Hitler was dead. The Wehrmacht had surrendered unconditionally. Church bells rang across the continent for the first time in 6 years without the shadow of Nazi occupation. It should have been a moment of pure triumph, uncomplicated joy, the culmination of years of sacrifice and struggle. But Patton's face, captured in photographs from that day, shows something other than celebration. His jaw is set, his eyes focused on something beyond the parade ground, beyond the immediate victory. He was looking east, toward the Soviet lines 60 miles away, where another army, an Allied army, was consolidating control over half of Europe. And what Patton saw there filled him not with relief, but with foreboding so profound that within weeks, it would destroy his career and relegate him to historical controversy for decades. The warning he was about to give, delivered in private meetings, in diary entries, in letters to his superiors, would be dismissed as the ravings of a warmonger drunk on his own success. His predictions about Soviet intentions would be labeled paranoid. His suggestions for confronting Stalin would be called insane. His increasingly reckless public statements about America's former ally would provide the excuse his enemies needed to remove him from command. By December 1945, Patton would be dead, killed in a car accident under circumstances that would spawn conspiracy theories for generations. His warnings would be filed away, forgotten in the rush to demobilize, to bring the boys home, to return to normalcy after the most destructive war in human history. But Patton had been right. Everything he predicted in those frantic months of 1945, the Soviet domination of Eastern Europe, the suppression of freedom from the Baltic to the Black Sea, the beginning of a new conflict that would divide the world for half a century, would come to pass with grim precision. The general who had raced across France and smashed through Germany, who had understood armored warfare and aggressive tactics better than almost any commander of his generation, had also understood something about political warfare, about totalitarian ambition, about the nature of the Soviet system. And that understanding, unwelcome and inconvenient in the spring of 1945, had made him dangerous to powerful men who preferred comfortable illusions to difficult truths. This is the story of what Patton saw, what he said, and why he was silenced. It is a story about the gap between military victory and political wisdom, about the costs of speaking truth to power, about the moment when America stood at the peak of its military strength and chose, for reasons both principled and naive, not to use it. And at the center of it is a symbol, not a weapon or a meal, but a document. The pocket notebook Patton carried throughout the final year of the war, filled with observations about Soviet behavior, predictions about Soviet intentions, and increasingly desperate pleas for someone in Washington to pay attention before it was too late. Patton's education about the Soviets had begun not in 1945 but years earlier, though he had not initially recognized what he was learning. In 1943, as American forces fought through North Africa and Sicily, intelligence reports began arriving from the Eastern Front, dry summaries of Soviet operations against German forces, casualty figures, territorial gains. The numbers were staggering. Soviet armies were destroying entire German divisions, suffering losses that would have broken any Western military, then reconstituting and attacking again. They fought with a brutality that shocked even veterans of the Desert War, taking few prisoners, showing no mercy to collaborators, treating their own soldiers as expendable resources to be fed into the meat grinder until German resistance broke. Patton had studied these reports with professional interest. The Soviets were allies, bearing the brunt of German military power, bleeding the Wehrmacht white on the endless Russian plains. American Lend-Lease supplies, trucks, aircraft, food, fuel were flowing to Soviet ports to sustain their war effort. Roosevelt and Churchill spoke of Stalin with respect, even affection, as Uncle Joe, the tough but reliable partner in the crusade against fascism. The official line was alliance, cooperation, shared sacrifice toward a common goal. But Patton had noted details that troubled him. The way Soviet intelligence officers interrogated German prisoners, not for tactical information but for political reliability, for signs of anti-communist sentiment. The reports from liberated Soviet POWs who feared returning to Stalin's control more than they feared remaining in German captivity. The accounts of Polish officers massacred by the Soviets at Patton Forest, which Soviet propaganda blamed on the Germans, but which German evidence suggested was Soviet work. The treatment of civilian populations in Soviet-occupied territory, the mass deportations, the political commissars, the summary executions of anyone deemed unreliable. He had written in his notebook, in the cramped handwriting of a man recording thoughts for his own reference, "The Russians are not like us. They do not value human life the same way. They do not share our conception of liberty. Whatever they are fighting for, it is not what we are fighting for." This was not yet criticism, just observation. But it was observation that would deepen as American and Soviet forces drew closer to convergence in the heart of Germany. By early 1945, as Third Army drove into Germany from the west while Soviet forces approached from the east, Patton was having direct encounters with Soviet officers. The official meetings were cordial, full of toasts to Allied cooperation and mutual congratulations on victories won. But away from the cameras, away from the interpreters and political officers, some Soviet commanders spoke more candidly. They spoke of orders from Moscow, of political control that extended into every military decision, of the NKVD units that followed the Red Army to ensure ideological compliance. They spoke, some of them, with the careful words of men who knew their own government feared them more than they had feared the Germans. And Patton watched Soviet behavior in occupied territory. He watched as NKVD units swept through liberated areas, arresting anyone who had cooperated with German occupation. Not just collaborators, but mayors who had kept towns running, teachers who had kept schools open, anyone whose competence might make them a political threat. He watched as Soviet forces seized industrial equipment from German factories and shipped it east, not as reparations, but as plunder, dismantling entire manufacturing plants. He watched as German civilians fled westward, desperate to reach American lines before Soviet forces arrived, because they had heard stories about what Soviet occupation meant. He documented this in his notebook. Names, dates, incidents. A Soviet officer boasting about how many fascists had been executed in a liberated Ukrainian village. Investigation revealed most were simply Ukrainian nationalists who had hoped German occupation might lead to independence from Moscow. NKVD units arresting Polish resistance fighters who had battled the Germans for 5 years, disappearing them to prisons in the East because their loyalty to Poland rather than the Soviet Union made them enemies. Soviet soldiers looting with systematic thoroughness, stripping German homes of everything valuable, behavior that was not the spontaneous excess of victorious troops, but organized policy from above. Patton showed these notes to his intelligence officers. He shared his concerns with his superiors, and he was told, politely but firmly, that such observations were not helpful. The Soviets were allies. Roosevelt had met with Stalin at Yalta and negotiated the post-war order. Agreements had been reached about occupation zones, about free elections in liberated countries, about cooperation in building a peaceful world. To question Soviet intentions was to question American policy at the highest levels. Patton was a general, a brilliant tactical commander, but politics was not his domain. He should focus on military operations and leave diplomacy to the diplomats. But on April 12, 1945, something happened that changed Patton's calculation. President Roosevelt died, and Harry Truman, a man who had barely been consulted on foreign policy during his brief vice presidency, became president. Truman did not have Roosevelt's personal relationship with Stalin, did not share Roosevelt's optimism about Soviet cooperation, did not carry the weight of Yalta agreements like sacred commitments. Patton saw an opening, a chance to make his case to a new administration that might be more receptive. On April 25th, American and Soviet forces met at the Elbe River at Torgau. The official photographs show soldiers embracing, exchanging cigarettes and vodka, celebrating the link-up that meant Germany was cut in two. Patton attended the ceremonies and smiled for the cameras, but in his notebook that night he wrote, "We have met a foe who is not yet recognized as such. The Russians will be our problem next. They are a scurvy race and simply savages. We could beat hell out of them." It was not yet a call to action, but it was a recognition. Blunt, politically radioactive, militarily premature, but rooted in observation of Soviet behavior that Patton believed American political leaders were deliberately ignoring. And in the weeks that followed, as Germany collapsed and Soviet forces consolidated control over Eastern Europe, Patton's concerns metastasized into something more dangerous. Conviction that America needed to act immediately before Soviet dominance became irreversible. By May, with German surrender complete, Patton was meeting with his corps commanders and staff officers, speaking with increasing frankness about what he saw as the Soviet threat. He argued that the United States should refuse to withdraw from the agreed-upon occupation zones until the Soviets allowed free elections in Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, all the countries where Soviet forces had established control. He suggested that American and British forces should maintain full readiness, should keep German POWs organized in units that could be rapidly rearmed if necessary, should prepare for the possibility that the next war might begin before this one truly ended. These were not casual comments. Patton was proposing nothing less than a fundamental reversal of American policy, from alliance with the Soviet Union to confrontation, from war against Germany to potential war against the USSR, from the grand coalition that had defeated Hitler to a new conflict that could become World War III. And he was proposing it at a moment when American public opinion was desperate for peace, when Allied armies were exhausted from 6 years of warfare, when the political will for another major conflict simply did not exist. His staff officers listened with varying degrees of alarm. Some shared his concerns about Soviet intentions. Others thought he had lost perspective, that his hatred of communism, Patton was politically conservative, contemptuous of socialism in any form, was clouding his military judgment. But all of them knew that what Patton was saying could not be said publicly, could not be put in official reports, could not be shared outside a very small circle without causing a political explosion. Patton did not care. On May 7th, he wrote in his diary, "I have been just as furious as I dare be at the compilation of lies which are told about the Germans and the glorious Red Army. I will probably be in the doghouse before it is over." He was beginning to speak more openly to journalists, to civilian officials, to anyone who would listen. He told one reporter that America had fought the wrong enemy, that Germany should have been an ally against the Soviet Union. He told Undersecretary of War Robert Patterson that the Soviet Union was a greater menace to civilization than was Germany. He told his own officers that they should be preparing to fight the Russians, and the sooner the better, while American armies were still mobilized, and before Soviet control of Eastern Europe became permanent. These statements, leaked or reported, created a firestorm. The American press, which had lionized Patton as a hero, began running stories questioning his judgment, his stability, even his loyalty to American policy. Political opponents seized on his comments as evidence of dangerous militarism. The Soviet press, which had praised American military cooperation, now published denunciations of Patton as a fascist, a warmonger, a man who had been corrupted by his association with defeated Nazis. And in Washington, officials who had tolerated Patton's eccentricities during wartime, his profanity, his flamboyance, his sometimes reckless aggression, began to see him as a liability in peacetime. The immediate issue was occupation policy. Germany had been divided into zones of occupation, Soviet in the east, American, British, and French in the west. Patton was appointed military governor of Bavaria, responsible for establishing order in a region devastated by war, flooded with refugees, still containing fanatical Nazi holdouts. It was a role requiring political sensitivity, careful diplomacy, cooperation with Allied control authorities. It was, in other words, precisely the wrong job for George Patton in the spring of 1945. He approached occupation with the same aggressive pragmatism he brought to military operations. Bavaria needed to be governed, which meant finding competent administrators. Many competent administrators had been members of the Nazi Party, not by ideological commitment, but because party membership had been effectively mandatory for government employment after 1933. Patton's policy was practical. Use whoever could do the job, regardless of past political affiliation, as long as they had not committed war crimes. Denazification would proceed, but it would proceed slowly, carefully, distinguishing between hardcore Nazis and ordinary Germans who had joined the party for practical reasons. This policy was anathema to those who believed in aggressive denazification, in collective German guilt, in the necessity of completely dismantling Nazi social structures before Reconstruction could begin. And when Patton defended his policy to journalists, he did so with his characteristic bluntness. This Nazi thing is just like a Democratic-Republican election fight. The comparison was tone-deaf, politically disastrous, and provided his enemies with the ammunition they needed. But the real issue was not denazification. The real issue was Patton's continued agitation about the Soviets. In private meetings with Eisenhower, now Supreme Commander of Occupation Forces, Patton pressed his case. American forces should not withdraw from Czechoslovakia, where they had advanced beyond the agreed-upon demarcation line. They should not pull back from Thuringia in Germany, which was supposed to be in the Soviet zone. They should maintain military readiness and make clear to Stalin that further Soviet expansion would be met with force. Eisenhower, under orders from Washington, rejected these suggestions. The agreements made at Yalta and Potsdam would be honored. American forces would withdraw to their designated zones. Cooperation with the Soviet Union would continue, because the alternative was to abandon the entire framework of post-war planning that Roosevelt had constructed. Patton's proposals, however well-intentioned, were politically impossible. Patton refused to let it go. He wrote letters to Chief of Staff George Marshall, to Secretary of War Henry Stimson, to anyone in Washington who might listen. He documented Soviet behavior in his notebook, every incident of cooperation denied, every promise broken, every sign that Stalin had no intention of allowing free elections or democratic governments in Soviet-occupied territory. And he predicted with grim accuracy what was coming. The Russians are Mongols, and the Mongols do not desire peace. They are out to dominate the world. His notebook entries became more desperate, more certain that he was watching the West make a catastrophic mistake. By September 1945, The political situation had become untenable. Patton's public statements about denazification, his private warnings about Soviet intentions, his general inability or unwillingness to function as a diplomat, had made him a liability. Eisenhower, under pressure from Washington and genuinely concerned about Patton's judgment, relieved him of command of Third Army. Patton was reassigned to command of the 15th Army, a paper organization responsible for compiling historical records. A desk job, a humiliation, a clear message that his active military career was over. Patton took the demotion with outward stoicism but private bitterness. He knew he had been silenced, removed from any position where his warnings about the Soviets might be heard. He knew that his predictions about Soviet behavior would be ignored, at least until events proved him right, and by then it would be too late to reverse Soviet control of Eastern Europe. He had fought across North Africa and Sicily and France and Germany, had commanded armies that destroyed Nazi military power, had earned a place among the great captains of American military history. And now he was being put out to pasture because he had told uncomfortable truths about America's ally. In his notebook, in entries from October and November 1945, he wrote with increasing darkness about betrayal, not just of him personally, but of the principles America had supposedly fought for. Freedom, democracy, self-determination, all the ideals that had justified the war were being abandoned in Eastern Europe. Poland, for which Britain had gone to war in 1939, was now under Soviet occupation, its government in exile ignored, its resistance fighters hunted by the NKVD. Czechoslovakia, a democracy before the war, was being drawn into the Soviet orbit despite Western promises of free elections. Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, all were becoming Soviet satellites, their political systems being remodeled on Stalin's orders. And the West, exhausted by war, desperate to believe that peace was possible, was allowing it to happen. American forces were demobilizing as rapidly as possible, soldiers shipping home by the hundreds of thousands, equipment being sold off or scrapped, the greatest military force ever assembled being dismantled in the rush to return to normalcy. British forces were in similar decline, their empire overstretched and their economy exhausted. The Western alliance that had defeated Hitler was effectively dissolving, while Soviet forces remained in place, maintaining full readiness, consolidating control. Patton saw this and knew it was a strategic catastrophe. He knew that the moment for action, the brief window when Western military superiority might have been used to enforce democratic principles, was closing. He knew that within a few years, the Soviet Union would have atomic weapons, would have rebuilt its economy, would be too strong to confront without risking global destruction. And he knew that no one WWII to hear this, because it meant acknowledging that the war had not truly ended, that the alliance with Stalin had been a necessary evil rather than a genuine partnership, that hard choices lay ahead instead of the peace everyone craved. On December 9, 1945, Patton was traveling by car from his headquarters to a hunting trip when his vehicle collided with an American Army truck. Patton suffered severe neck injuries, a broken neck, paralysis from the neck down. He was taken to a hospital in Heidelberg where he remained conscious, lucid, aware that his injuries were fatal. For 12 days, he lay in that hospital bed, unable to move, surrounded by doctors who could do nothing except manage his pain and wait for the end. He died on December 21, 1945, 12 days after the accident, 7 months after the end of the war in Europe. He was 60 years old. The official cause of death was pulmonary edema and congestive heart failure resulting from his injuries. The accident was ruled just that, an accident, a traffic collision of the kind that killed thousands of American soldiers during the occupation period, when exhausted drivers navigated unfamiliar roads in captured vehicles with poor maintenance. But questions arose immediately. The circumstances of the collision were odd. Why had the truck turned directly into Patton's path? Why were there no other witnesses? Why did Patton's driver give conflicting accounts of the accident? Why was the truck driver, who should have faced military inquiry, quickly transferred out of Germany? The questions spawned conspiracy theories that persist to this day. That Patton was assassinated, either by the Soviets who feared his anti-communist agitation, or by American intelligence agencies that found him too dangerous to allow him to continue speaking publicly. The truth is probably simpler and sadder. Patton died in a mundane traffic accident, the kind of random tragedy that war veterans survive only to succumb to in peacetime. But the conspiracy theories persist because Patton's warnings about the Soviets, dismissed as paranoid in 1945, were proven accurate within a few years. Everything he predicted came to pass. Soviet domination of Eastern Europe, the suppression of freedom, the beginning of the Cold War, the division of the continent by an iron curtain. And people naturally wondered, if his predictions about Soviet behavior were right, might his death have been less random than it appeared? The notebook survived. After Patton's death, his personal effects were collected and eventually donated to archives. The small leather-bound notebook he had carried through the last year of the war, filled with observations about Soviet behavior and predictions about Soviet intentions, was filed away with thousands of other documents from the war. Historians would rediscover it decades later, reading entries that seemed prophetic in hindsight, that documented in real time the process by which one American general came to understand what many in Washington preferred not to see. There is an entry from June 1945, written shortly after a meeting with Soviet officers at which toasts had been exchanged and official pleasantries observed. They are a scurvy race and simply savages. We could beat hell out of them. But no one listens. No one wants to hear that our ally is our next enemy. So I will write it here in this notebook, and someday perhaps someone will read it and understand that we knew and chose not to act. Another entry from August. The stuff in the papers about fraternization with the Germans is all wet. It is not fraternization when you treat people decently. But we are told to be harsh to the Germans while being friendly to the Russians, who are looting and raping their way across Europe. The world has gone mad, and I am considered the madman for pointing it out. And a final entry from early December, just days before the accident. I am to go home soon. They have made it clear I am no longer useful here. Perhaps it is better. I cannot watch this betrayal and remain silent, and my words accomplish nothing except to anger those who prefer comfortable lies. At least in America I may speak more freely. At least there I may warn what is coming, even if no one wishes to hear it. He never made it home, but his warnings, preserved in that notebook and in the memories of officers who had heard him speak, would be vindicated within a few years. By 1946, Winston Churchill was delivering his Iron Curtain speech, warning that Soviet domination of Eastern Europe represented a fundamental threat to Western security. By 1947, the Truman Doctrine was committing American resources to containing Soviet expansion. By 1948, the Berlin blockade was demonstrating Soviet willingness to use force to maintain control of occupied territory. By 1949, NATO was being formed as a military alliance explicitly directed against Soviet aggression. And by 1950, American and Soviet Baki D forces were fighting in Korea, the Cold War having turned hot on the Asian peninsula. Everything Patton had predicted in the spring and summer of 1945 had come to pass. The Soviets had not honored agreements about free elections. They had not withdrawn from occupied territory. They had established communist dictatorships across Eastern Europe and were exporting revolution wherever possible. And the West, having demobilized its forces and dismantled its wartime alliance structures, was scrambling to rebuild military strength and political coherence to confront a threat that Patton had identified when it might still have been stopped. The question that haunted American strategic thinkers for decades was whether Patton had been right not just in his analysis, but in his recommendations. Should the United States have confronted the Soviet Union in 1945, when American military superiority was overwhelming, when Soviet forces were exhausted from 4 years of brutal warfare, when the atomic bomb gave America a temporary monopoly on ultimate weapons? Could a firm stance then have prevented the Cold War, have preserved freedom in Eastern Europe, have avoided 45 years of nuclear standoff and proxy conflicts? The answer is unknowable. What is clear is that Patton saw what was coming and tried to warn his superiors, and was silenced for it, not through sinister conspiracy, but through the ordinary operation of political systems that found his warnings inconvenient, his recommendations politically impossible, and his continued public agitation more trouble than it was worth. He was not assassinated. He was marginalized, demoted, sent to a meaningless position where his voice could not influence policy. The accident that killed him simply completed a process of silencing that had already succeeded. But the notebook remained, testament to what one general had understood when many others preferred not to. In its pages, written in cramped handwriting in moments stolen between official duties, was a record of observation and analysis that proved more accurate than the policy papers being produced in Washington, more prophetic than the diplomatic cables being exchanged with Moscow, more honest than the public statements being made about Allied cooperation and post-war harmony. Patton had been many things: brilliant and flawed, aggressive and reckless, a military genius and a political liability. He had won battles that others thought impossible, had driven his men beyond normal human endurance, had understood armored warfare with an instinctive clarity that made him one of the great commanders of the 20th century. He had also been arrogant, insubordinate, contemptuous of those he considered inferior, capable of statements that were offensive even by the standards of his time. But on the question of Soviet intentions, he had been right when it mattered, had seen clearly what official policy obscured, had tried to warn that military victory against Germany had not secured the peace, that a new threat was emerging even as the old one was defeated. And he had been silenced, not by bullets or bombs, not by dramatic assassination, but by the ordinary mechanisms of political control. Reassignment, demotion, official displeasure, the message that his continued warnings were unwelcome and his continued presence in command was impossible. The notebook, preserved in archives, speaks across the decades. It speaks to the difficulty of challenging official consensus, of saying unpopular truths, of warning about dangers that others prefer not to see. It speaks to the gap between military insight and political wisdom, between tactical brilliance and strategic vision. And it speaks to the cost of being right too soon, before the world is ready to hear what you have to say. In the end, Patton's warnings were vindicated, but only after it was too late to act on them in the way he had proposed. By the time American policy shifted to confronting the Soviet Union, the moment of overwhelming Western military superiority had passed. The Cold War would be fought not through the direct military confrontation Patton had suggested in 1945, but through decades of nuclear deterrence, proxy conflicts, economic competition, and ideological struggle. Eastern Europe would remain under Soviet control until 1989, when internal economic contradictions and political exhaustion would accomplish what Western military force never attempted. Whether Patton's approach would have worked, whether American threats in 1945 could have forced Soviet withdrawal from Eastern Europe without triggering World War III, remains one of history's great counterfactuals. What is not counterfactual is that he saw what was coming, tried to warn, and was silenced by a political establishment that found his warnings inconvenient and his continued advocacy intolerable. There is a photograph from June 1945 taken at a formal dinner between American and Soviet officers. Patton sits at the table, his uniform impeccable, his face composed in the expression of official cordiality required by the occasion. Beside him sits a Soviet general, raising a glass in toast to Allied cooperation. Patton raises his own glass in response, and the camera captures what appears to be a moment of friendship, of shared celebration of victory won. But in the notebook, in an entry from that same night, Patton wrote, "I smiled and drank toasts with the Russians today. I did so because I am a soldier and I follow orders. But in my heart I was toasting the day when we will have the courage to face the truth about our new enemy. That day will come. I only hope it comes before they have made themselves too strong to defeat without catastrophic cost. I fear it will not. I fear we are drinking toasts while Rome burns, celebrating victory while preparing defeat." It was the warning of a prophet, delivered to a world that preferred not to listen. Within 7 months, Patton would be dead. Within 7 years, his predictions would be common wisdom. And the notebook, that small leather-bound record of one general's observations and fears, would become a symbol, not of conspiracy or assassination, but of something more prosaic and perhaps more tragic. The cost of speaking uncomfortable truths, the difficulty of challenging consensus, the fate of those who see clearly when others prefer comforting blindness. Patton had warned. He had documented what he saw, had tried to make his superiors understand, had pushed until he was pushed out. And when he died, that notebook was all that remained of his warnings. Pages of observations and predictions that would gather dust in archives, until historians, decades later, would read them and understand that the general who knew too much had been silenced not by conspiracy, but by the ordinary operation of systems that reward convenient lies over difficult truths. The war had been won, the peace had been lost, and the man who tried to warn that the two were not the same had paid with his career and, through random tragedy or darker design, with his life. The notebook survived to tell the tale, pages of cramped handwriting speaking across generations about the moment when America stood at the peak of power and chose, for reasons both principled and naive, not to use it to secure the freedom for which the war had supposedly been fought. That is the legacy of Patton's final campaign. Not victory but warning, not triumph but tragedy, not assassination but marginalization. He had been right, and being right had destroyed him. And the notebook remained, testament to what happens when truth-tellers speak too soon, when military insight challenges political convenience, when one man sees clearly what an entire system prefers to ignore. It is a lesson written in fading ink on yellowed pages, filed away in archives, waiting for anyone who cares to learn what happens when generals know too much and say what must not be said.